month ago, Mr. Neumann has been here in the Institute in a working group on terrorism and political violence. So we challenge him to make a wider presentation to a wider audience on the same subject. So he kindly accepted our challenge, and here he is for a conference on the threat of foreign fighters, links between terror and crime, and the future of ISIS. The conference will be run according to the following sequence. Firstly, Mr. Neumann is going to say a few words, then Mr. Bashra is going to continue, and then to conclude, Mr. Neumann will take the floor again. And we will have a debate period with questions from the audience. So, since we don't have much time, I present Mr. Peter Newman, Professor of Security Studies at the Department of War Studies, King's College, London, and has founded the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. He currently serves as the OSCE Chairman Special Representative for Fighting Radicalization, and advises the Club de Madrid, the Association of Former Presidents and Prime Ministers, and was a senior consultant for the United States mission to the United Nations during the process of crafting the UN Security Council Resolution 2178 on foreign terrorist fighters. Neumann is a member of the editorial board of three leading peer-reviewed journals, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, the Journal of Strategic Studies and Democracy and Security, and serves as an investigator for the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. He has written numerous books, policy reports, and articles dealing with different aspects of terrorism and radicalization. Since we don't have time, I present Mr. Rajan Bashra. He studies the relationship between crime and terrorism, focusing on individuals that transition between these two activities. He is completing a PhD in War Studies at King's College London, examining the crime-terror nexus in Europe, and holds an MA in Terrorism, Security and Society from King's College London, and an undergraduate degree in Politics from the University of Warwick. He has written numerous reports, journal articles, and book chapters dealing with different aspects of terrorism and radicalization. Mr. Neumann, you have the floor, sir.
So, thank you very much for turning out in such numbers today. It's a great honor for me and Rajan to be here with you today and to speak about this topic. And thank you also to the Institute for bringing us here again. It's always a pleasure to be in Lisbon, and thanks especially to people in the outposts of the Portuguese Empire who are attending this. And I know it's always a little bit more boring if you have to watch something on a video screen rather than seeing people in person. I hope we can make it as interesting and as educational as possible. So I will start first by speaking about the future of ISIS and the threat of foreign fighters and what to expect. And Rajan, as you could see from his biography, is our expert on links between terrorism and crime, and he will focus on that particular aspect during his segment of the presentation in the middle. But first, I want to speak a little bit about what we should expect. A lot of people have stopped speaking about terrorism. We haven't had many attacks recently, and Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, which used to be on the screens and in the news every single day of the week, has almost completely disappeared. And that's of course because there haven't been many attacks recently. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization behind these attacks has suddenly disappeared or has suddenly gone away. In fact, if you read some of the literature on this subject, you will see that there is a very engaging debate right now about what is going to happen with that organization and what is going to happen with so-called jihadist terrorism in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Some people, for example, my colleague Hassan, predicts that there will be a resurgence of ISIS, that ISIS might come back, that they are waiting out the current situation, and that they are ready to reappear in their traditional homeland of Syria and Iraq. Other people, like for example my colleague Shiraz Mayer from London, predict that ISIS will become something different, that it will transform into an international terrorist network like Al-Qaeda used to be. Some people indeed predict the future return to Al-Qaeda, like for example Bruce Hoffman, and other people are talking about relocation, that ISIS, having been defeated more or less in Syria and Iraq, will reappear in other places across the world, perhaps in Afghanistan, perhaps in Libya, perhaps in Yemen. So you see a lot of different predictions, and the truth is no one knows exactly where ISIS is going to be in 5 or 10 years' time. But there is a consensus. It's a weak consensus, but it is a consensus. The consensus is that Daesh or ISIS or its members are not going to go away. An organization which has attracted 40,000 people over the last 5 years from 100 different countries is not just going to disappear as much as it may be defeated in its homeland. And secondly, that this is a moment of profound change. In 5, 10, or 15 years' time, we will look back to these years, to 2018, 19, 20, and we will say, looking back historically, that this was the moment that the organization and the movement transformed into something else. What that something else is, we cannot say at this point in time, but it is a profound moment of change. And so whilst I cannot give you the definitive answer, whilst I do not know, I know as much as these individuals here, I can give you some of the indicators, some of the trends that we're seeing. And I want to briefly talk about 3 positive developments and then mention 3 causes of concern. The first positive development that I want to mention is, of course, that ISIS or Islamic State, Daesh, has been more or less militarily defeated in its traditional homeland. 98% of the territory that the organization used to have in Syria and Iraq has been retaken by the Kurds, by the Iraqis, by the Syrians. The caliphate, which at the peak of its existence was as big in terms of territory as Great Britain and had a population of 8 to 10 million people, has been reduced to a tiny little area between the borders of Syria and Iraq. And that means that ISIS no longer has the territorial, the physical basis for organizing big operations. It is no longer the force that it used to be. But equally importantly, I would say that this is significant not only because the safe haven and the operational basis has been destroyed, but it's also destroyed the utopia, the idea of the caliphate that attracted so many people from across the world. The reason why 40,000 people from 100 different countries went to Syria and Iraq was not just because there was a territory, but because of what this territory represented. People were being told that in 100 years' time, people will still be speaking about those brave young Western men who went to Syria and Iraq in order to rebuild the caliphate. It was an exciting time. People were enthusiastic. They thought that they were going to participate in the rebuilding of an empire. And the fact that only 3 years later, that so-called empire has already been reduced to maybe 2% of what it used to be, has in fact caused a crisis of legitimacy amongst the supporters of that ideology. So it's not only been about the physical destruction of the so-called caliphate. With the physical destruction, there has also been a destruction, if you want, of the idea behind it, the idea that attracted so many people, that excited so many people for a short period in 2014, 15, and maybe 16. So that's undoubtedly a positive development from the perspective of people who are opposed to ISIS. A second positive development is that the so-called virtual caliphate that some people predicted, that virtual caliphate has not risen. A lot of people, when ISIS started being defeated, talked about the idea that a lot of its supporters would become even more active online. That with the destruction of the physical caliphate, we would see a migration towards the internet, that even more people would be active online, and that hasn't happened. A colleague of ours in London, Charlie Winter, he's a very close follower of the online propaganda activities of ISIS. In 2015, he counted 37 media offices of ISIS that were publishing ISIS propaganda almost every day. They were responsible for producing all the videos that we heard about a couple of years ago. And if you compare the situation in 2015 to the situation today, you will see that of those 37 offices, only 5 offices are left. And that is also reflected in the output of propaganda. And I gave you 2 separate studies here, one from the BBC, the other one from my colleague, who basically don't agree completely, but agree on the broad trend. And the number of ISIS items of videos and propaganda statements that have been published on a monthly basis, you can see very clearly has been trending down. So the virtual caliphate has not risen. On the contrary, with the decline of the physical caliphate, we've also seen a decline of the online activities of Islamic State and its associate groups. So that's also undoubtedly a positive development. And the third positive development is perhaps a slightly qualified one. Because if you look at the statistics here, and this is a graph produced by one of my colleagues in Norway, Petter Nessa, he's counted all the terrorist plots in Europe since 1994. And you can see, perhaps not very clearly, but I tell you about it, that the number of terrorist plots remains at a very high level. We had, I think, nearly 18 plots in 2017, and the numbers in 2018 are slightly lower, but still at a very high level compared to previous years. But the reason you haven't heard so much about them is that they are smaller operations. So instead of the big terrorist attacks that we saw, for example, 2015 in Paris, we have knife attacks. We have small attempted attacks. We have attacks that are less connected to ISIS. They're more inspired attacks. These are individuals, lone operators, who are inspired by the ideology, but who aren't part of the chain of command of ISIS. And the recruitment seems to have slowed quite decisively. The jihadist networks that exist in Europe have not grown in the last 1 or 2 years. They have remained at the same level, which means that the threat is not over, but at least it has stopped increasing. And a lot of police forces and intelligence services that I talk to across Europe almost weekly basis, they are telling me that for the first time now, they think they can manage with the existing threat. So, in conclusion, the number of terrorist plots has not necessarily decreased, but it has grown slower. They're smaller operations, they're less connected to ISIS. The virtual caliphate has not risen, and the utopia has been destroyed. Those are the positive developments. But that, of course, doesn't mean we can sit back, because there are also still issues of concern. And here are 3 of the things that we should continue to worry about. The first one is, and now I'm coming to the topic of returnee foreign fighters. The first one is that no one knows exactly how the threat associated with these returning foreign fighters, these so-called returning foreign fighters, is going to play out. These are figures from end of 2015. They're not the most up-to-date figures, but they give you an idea of the proportions that have been involved. From the largest European countries, we have seen, of course, the largest numbers of so-called foreign fighters, people from these countries who've gone to Syria and Iraq in order to join ISIS, France, Britain, Germany. Interestingly, we've seen a number of smaller European countries, especially in Northern Europe and Northwestern Europe, being very strongly overrepresented. So for example, Belgium has produced nearly 500 foreign fighters. Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, Austria, you could also add to that list, producing disproportionate number of foreign fighters considering their size. Overall, you can say between 5,000 and 6,000 Western Europeans since 2013 have gone to Syria and Iraq predominantly in order to join ISIS. The question is, now that the caliphate in Syria and Iraq has been defeated, what's happening to them? Well, broadly speaking, around 20 to 25% of them have died. So nothing is going to happen to them. Around 30% have already returned. And you can see here our latest figures that we've recently published based on official figures from all the different countries. You can see under the blue arrow on the left, you can see the numbers of people who have already returned. So in the case of, let's say, Germany, for example, you can see 960 fighters in total, and 303 have returned. So around a third of them have returned, 20 to 25% have died, which means that around 40% of the people who had originally gone to Syria and Iraq are still in the region. Some are in custody, some are in prisons in Iraq or are held by the Kurds, some are still with ISIS, some are in other places in the region, for example in Turkey. The expectation is that many of them, not all at once, but many of them will return or will try to return to their home countries over the next few years. The question is, of course, will that be a threat? Will that make the security situation worse? My argument would be that they will not necessarily produce more attacks, but they will perhaps professionalize some of the terrorist plots that we have seen in Europe over the past 4 or 5 years. Remember what I said before. Many of the terrorist attacks that we see right now are very small plots, almost amateurish plots. They are people who are using knives to kill people. And that, of course, is horrible, but it also doesn't really threaten security in our countries very much. The danger is, of course, that as you see some of these so-called foreign fighters returning, you do have fighters who have fought in a conflict, who have been trained, who have been brutalized because they've been fighting in a civil war for many years. And you also have people who are internationally networked, who know other people who are equally specialized. And there are empirical studies that show that whenever you have terrorist plots that have people participate who have been trained or who have fought in foreign conflicts, the resulting terrorist plots become more significant and more likely to go ahead. So my prediction would be that as more of these people are returning to their home countries, those who will continue to be involved in terrorism will have the effect of professionalizing some of the attacks that we have seen. I don't think it was an accident that by far the most devastating terrorist attack that has happened over the past 4 or 5 years, the terrorist attack in November 2015 in Paris, in the Bataclan, that was a terrorist attack that was carried out exclusively by returning foreign fighters. They knew what to do. They knew how to organize a terrorist attack. The second ongoing concern is that, of course, ISIS, Daesh, continues to focus on inciting terrorism, even more so than before. In 2014-15, they were not so focused on terrorism. They were telling supporters, come to Syria and Iraq, join us, because we need you here to rebuild the caliphate. Nowadays, if you read messages coming from ISIS, they are no longer saying that. They are no longer telling their followers to come to Syria and Iraq. They are telling their followers to stay where they are in their Western home countries and carry out terrorist attacks. And if you look at the propaganda, you see exactly what kind of terrorist attacks they are promoting, using knives, using vehicles the sort of terrorist attacks that we have seen, unfortunately, on the streets of Europe. And thirdly and finally, we have seen, of course, in recent months, the appearance of new profiles and new actors. And the first one that I'm going to talk about before handing over to Rajan is the increasing prominence of women. And that's very interesting because for jihadist groups, up until recently, women were almost completely irrelevant. They were supporting men. All they were interested in, all these organizations were interested in, was to recruit young men to fight against what they considered to be unbelievers. So Al-Qaeda was telling its supporters, come to Afghanistan, come to Somalia, come to different places across the world and help us fight against the unbelievers. And that was a message that was almost exclusively directed towards men, towards young men. Then the caliphate came along, 2014, and ISIS started to build a state. And suddenly the message shifted. And ISIS was telling supporters, yes, we still need fighters, we still need young men, but we also need women. We also need nurses, we need teachers, we need female doctors, we need the mothers of the next generation of fighters in the caliphate. And suddenly the narrative of ISIS, for the first time in the history of jihadist movements, started explicitly to include females. So that's why numbers of women started going there from 2014 onwards. And then there has been another twist, and that's happened in the last 12 months. Over the last 12, 18 months, you've seen ISIS starting to say not only that women can come to the caliphate and that women can take more active roles, but for the first time ISIS has said women should actively participate in terrorist plots. In other words, women should be fighters and can be fighters as well. There have been a number of so-called fatwas, of legal rulings, in which ISIS has blessed the participation of women in terrorist attacks. There have even been videos that have shown women with Kalashnikovs fighting. And indeed, in the middle of 2016 in Europe, you had the first significant terrorist plot in France, in Paris, where 4 women were attempting to blow themselves up at Notre Dame Cathedral. And only 3 months ago, you had the first mother and daughter terrorist attack in Indonesia, where a mother and a daughter blew themselves up. So this was unimaginable 10 or 15 years ago, but ISIS is increasingly promoting the use of women in terrorist attacks, and this is not necessarily something we will see every day, but it is something that I think we will see more frequently in years to come. So that's a new profile, a new actor that security intelligence agencies have to think about when thinking about terrorism, because traditionally when thinking about terrorism, we're thinking about young men of fighting age. But this is changing, and this will probably be important in years to come. And a second profile that is important, and that Rajan will talk more about, is the use of petty criminals who have transitioned and radicalized into extremist violence. I'll hand over at this point, Rajan, before coming back.
One of the new developments that we've seen is the prevalence of people with criminal pasts become involved in jihadism. And to understand what the picture is today, I think it's useful to look back at what it was in the 90s and early 2000s. So academics in Europe by the name of Edwin Bakker and the former CIA operations officer Mark Sageman studied Al-Qaeda recruits up until 2004, and they found that by and large they were university educated, they were in skilled employment, and they were from the middle and upper classes of their societies. These were the proverbial engineers and the doctors of jihad. If you look at people involved in terrorism in the last 5 years in Europe, so if you want to call them Generation ISIS, you see the profile has shifted somewhat. And the figures on the right here are from the German authorities who've analyzed the 800 foreign fighters that travel from that country, and it's a really different picture. So very few of them were university educated. Most were actually known to the police for something other than their extremism, and a third of them had criminal convictions. And in contrast to the Al-Qaeda recruits, a quarter of these were unemployed. So you can see there's been a general, not a total, shift in the types of people attracted to jihadist movements. And we see this elsewhere in Europe as well, not just in Germany. So if in Germany 2/3 were known to the police and a third had criminal convictions, we see that in Spain, a third of people arrested for jihadist offenses over the last 4 years were also known to the authorities as common criminals. In Italy, 44% of the foreign fighters that traveled to Syria and Iraq also were common delinquents. In France, it's 48%. Belgium, half of the country's foreign fighters were common criminals. We spoke to counter-terrorism officials in Norway, and they said over 60% of that country's foreign fighters were also criminals. And the same is true of those that travel from the Netherlands. So we've seen literally hundreds of criminals get involved in jihadism in the last few years. Myself, Peter, and the team at ICSR, we began to study this, to analyze, well, what does this matter? What is the consequence of this, and how does it affect their process of radicalization? And the first thing that we saw is that this is not an exclusive phenomenon to the jihadist movement. We also see this trend amongst the far right as well, albeit it's less pronounced. It seems to be something inherent in jihadism these days that is attracting criminals. And the first thing that we see is that they have a particular radicalization trajectory where they have this idea of redemption, that they are going to, quite simply, purify the sins that they've committed, and they're looking to wipe the slate clean and have a new lease of life. And you could see this in the words of jihadists themselves. So there was a Danish gangster who was interviewed before he traveled to Syria and Iraq about his motivations. And he said, I don't really know what's going to happen. Maybe I'm going to die there, and so what? Because, some people have died in my hands, and this is a big problem when I meet Allah. It's not good enough just praying with everything that I've done. I've got to try and make a difference. I think about Judgment Day, but at least I can say I went down there and did what I could. So you can see he definitely had this narrative that he wanted a new start in life to make up for his criminal sins. This is a really intuitive idea. But we also have to ask, well, why is it they find this in jihadism and not elsewhere? And occasionally we see this reflected in the propaganda of these groups. So this is a poster produced by a British jihadist group with the slogan, sometimes people with the worst past create the best futures. And I don't know about you in this room, but for me, this is quite an inspirational slogan. And they would post this online on Facebook, Instagram, on Twitter in 2014 when it was easy to do so, again emphasizing the redemptive qualities of jihadism. But why do they get involved in that and they don't get involved in something pacifistic? There are a few possible explanations. One is ideological, the promise of martyrdom, of going to heaven. The other is behavioral. For someone to get involved in violent crime and then get involved in violent extremism may satisfy a lot of their internal desires and narratives. I'm talking about status, power, respect, and belonging. And I also think the third explanation is one, very practical social networks. We consistently see that they're attracted to jihadism via their friends and their family, who manage to bring them in to that milieu and that subculture. Another trend we see amongst these criminals that become jihadists is that their involvement in jihadism gives them a license to commit crime. It actually legitimizes the criminal acts they've committed before and encourages them to do that again in the future. And we see this clearly in the case of the propaganda produced by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There was a famous article produced by Anwar al-Awlaki, a scholar, a propagandist and a recruiter, where he basically said that rather than the Muslims financing the jihad from their own pockets, they should finance it from the pockets of their enemies. Again, this is a really simple understanding of the world. And we see this reflected on the street level. So from the propaganda, from the recruiter and ideologue, down to a would-be jihadist traveling to Syria, who was interviewed, this is a French jihadist, about how he was going to fund his trip. And this was his response. With fictitious jobs and fake payslips, you open accounts in banks, you take credit, you take the cash. They're the spoils of war, and it's halal, you see. For this street-level recruit, I don't think he needed to understand all the ideological nuance of when it's acceptable to commit crime for the sake of jihad. He just needed to know that it was acceptable to do so. And we've seen this point repeatedly emphasized in propaganda produced by the Islamic State. So last year, in their online Rumiyah magazine, they produced a 12-page spread where they outlined all the historical clauses of when you can commit crime for the sake of jihad, when you can't, and what you can do, and so on. But their message was a very simple one. It is a must on every monotheist, muwahid, to expand the scope of his jihad to include waging war on the non-believer's wealth. So there's been a slight shift. Before, 10 years ago, Al-Qaeda was saying it's permissible, it's okay to do so. Now Islamic State is saying it's not only permissible, it's obligatory. You have to go and commit crime. But we've yet to see the full effects of this on the street level, because not everyone consumes propaganda at the same rate, not everyone acts on propaganda at the same rate. And to be frank, many jihadists were involved in this well before Islamic State ever put this propaganda out. But we've seen the effects of this in the streets of Belgium. This is a mugshot of Khalid Zarqani, a very handsome man, as you can see. And he essentially recruited a gang of young men in the Molenbeek neighborhood of Brussels and told them to go to the train stations, the bus stations, and carry out robberies, steal people's phones, their passports, their cameras. He would convert those goods into cash and give that cash to jihadists who wanted to travel to Syria and Iraq. So because he was giving it out, the money out like it was a gift, and because of his big beard, he got the nickname Papa Noel, Father Christmas. And he alone was responsible for over 70 people traveling to Syria and Iraq, including many of the people involved in the Paris attacks and Brussels attacks. Another phenomena that we see amongst this criminal turned jihadist population is the role of prisons, where a consistent cohort have spent time in prison on regular criminal convictions, let's say for drug dealing, for robbery, for theft, and inside they radicalize and they adopt extremist ideas and they meet other extremists, and that continues upon their release. And it's quite easy to see why. Because prisons foster a sense of vulnerability. You're detached from your normal social environments and your social support networks. You're often in a hostile place where you have to find new connections for your physical safety. You often have existential crises going on where you're thinking about your life choices, which may make you receptive to new ideas. And you can think of who actually ends up in prison. You're talking about young men who have problems with the law and they're not so risk averse. And so you put all of these things together, it's easy to see why someone in prison could become attracted to an extremist cause. And prisons also foster networking. And this is when an extremist could be in prison and connect with criminals. Criminals can connect with criminals, or extremists could actually meet other extremists that they never would have come across outside of prison. So we've consistently seen attacks in Europe where the genesis was people who met in prison. They formed a friendship. They were in the same wing, they were in the same cell, that continued upon release and culminated in a terrorist attack. And finally, we see amongst this cohort of criminals that they adapt their criminal skills to the purpose of terrorism. And the most obvious one is access to weapons. And you could see this in the propaganda the groups put out there. They've given advice on how to get a hold of a weapon if you're a jihadist. So in their French language magazine, Dar al-Islam, they've told you, if you're going to get a weapon, you want to dress like a jeune de cité, a youth from the housing estate who's looking to make a robbery with a weapon. Essentially, disguise your motivations. Don't go in with a big beard. Don't go in with a thobe. You want to appear like you're a regular criminal so that the arms dealer doesn't hesitate to do any business with you. Another skill we see is the access to fraudulent documents, which they usually get from existing criminal networks, typically those involved in human trafficking. We could see this clearly in the case of the Paris and Brussels network. And throughout the attack planning, that network used fake documents to travel between countries, to rent out safe houses, and to rent cars and so on. So here are two photos of people involved in that network. And after the attack, it was discovered that they adopted these identities, complete with fake glasses and wigs. They use this throughout their attack planning. And another skill that we see, I think, that is worth closer attention is that of financing, where many jihadists have used criminal means to raise money for their attacks. And studies of this are actually quite rare, but a Norwegian researcher by the name of Emily Oftedal, she studied jihadist plots in Europe from 1994 to 2013 to figure out, well, how are they actually making their money? And she found that 40% use criminal sources in whole or in part, whereas the vast majority, 73%, use legitimate sources in whole or in part. So we're talking about savings, we're talking about salaries or borrowing money from friends and family. But amongst the criminal sources of fundraising, we see a pretty interesting picture. And as a case study, I can call on the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which you see on the screen here. When the brothers behind this attack were analyzed, you showed that they had three sources. Firstly, they used consumer loans of 6,000 and 27,000 euros, which were fraudulently obtained by faking their payslips. They pretended to the bank that they earned much more money than they actually did. And the bank failed to do any due diligence and gave them that money. The second was trading counterfeits. One of the attackers, he ran a market stall in Paris where he sold fake Nike trainers, of all things, which he was importing from China and then selling on the streets. And finally, they sold drugs. So Ahmadi Koulibaly, a jihadist who teamed up with these two brothers, was selling hashish, was selling cannabis in the streets of Paris. And what you'll see from all of these sources of funding is that they're just regular criminal means. And in fact, the jihadists were involved in this well before they'd conceived of carrying out a jihadist attack. And this makes counter-terrorist financing difficult, I would say, because there's no way of distinguishing the money that they're going to use for their regular lifestyle and their criminal activities from those that is going to go to their jihadist attacks. So all in all, this is what we've seen in Europe, where criminals have become involved in jihadism en masse, they've radicalized in particular ways, and they've used their criminal skills for the purpose of jihadism.
So this gives you a sense of another trend, another profile, another new type of actor that we've seen become more prominent with what Rajan called Generation ISIS. And this is something to look out for, and this is something that also will influence how jihadists change. What we've also seen is the use of so-called copycats. We've seen an attack in the German town of Münster, for example, where someone with serious psychological difficulties basically carried out an attack that looked like an ISIS attack, inspired by what he had seen on TV, but the person himself, of course, had no jihadist motivation whatsoever. The same happened in Toronto also this summer, another vehicle attack that was very much ISIS style, but that was carried out by someone with severe psychological difficulties. One of the perhaps most significant threats for European societies going forward is the idea of cumulative or reciprocal radicalization. Basically, you have such an extent of polarization within European societies that you will see people from the far right carry out ISIS-style attacks against ordinary Muslims. Last year we had an attack in London, where we come from, carried out by a far-right extremist driving a car into a mosque. And he later said to police that his intention was to take revenge on what he considered to be the ISIS-supporting Muslims by doing to them what they had done, quote-unquote, to us. And there is, of course, a risk of cycles of vicious radicalization affecting not only jihadist supporters, but also other sectors of society. So these are things that are likely to be factors moving forward, and that I think all of us have to be very careful about. And I know, of course, this threat doesn't affect Portugal as much as it affects countries like Britain or France, Belgium, Germany. But these are things still nevertheless worth thinking about. So in conclusion, I want to perhaps summarize some of the takeaways that I think are important to reflect on and perhaps to discuss afterwards. The first and most important one is that the fallout from what's happened in Syria and Iraq over the past 5 or 6 years, that this fallout will preoccupy us for many years to come. And the reason for that is something related to the foreign fighters. If we look at historical mobilizations of foreign fighters in the past, here's a table by a Norwegian colleague of mine, Thomas Heckhammer, who estimated the number of foreign fighters involved in every conflict in the Muslim world since the 1940s. And basically, to summarize, there's only one conflict here which has mobilized a similar number of foreign fighters compared to what we've seen over the past 5 or 6 years. And that was, of course, for those of you who are interested in this, that was, of course, the conflict in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And if you look at the numbers here, according to this estimate, according to the most liberal estimate, the conflict in Afghanistan back then against the Soviet Union, supported by a lot of countries, including Western countries, generated and mobilized at most 20,000 fighters over the course of an entire decade. Now, in relation to Syria and Iraq, we've seen twice that number, 40,000, being mobilized in half of the time in just 5 years. So that signifies, or that shows you the scale of mobilization that has taken place in relation to Syria. And in Afghanistan, of course, the people who went there, which included, of course, Osama bin Laden, who started his quote-unquote career in international terrorism as a foreign fighter in Afghanistan in 1984. Of course, the people there were asking themselves an important question. At the end of the 1980s, the conflict ended, and those 20,000, if that's the number, those 20,000 that had gone there were asking themselves, what do we do now? The conflict has ended. What do we do now? We cannot return, in many cases, to our home countries. We have trained, we have brutalized ourselves, we have networked amongst each other, we have developed an esprit de corps amongst ourselves. What now? And then over the following 2 decades, over the 1990s and 2000s, you saw veterans, the so-called veterans of the Afghanistan conflict, turn up in literally every other conflict in the Muslim world, from Bosnia to Chechnya to Algeria to even the Philippines. You had the veterans of the Afghanistan conflict typically bringing their expertise, bringing their skills, making these conflicts more fundamentalists, more violent, and more difficult to resolve. So over the course of 2 decades, these people turned up in different conflicts, and of course, some of them got together in an international terrorist network that from the mid-1990s onwards became known as Al-Qaeda, which attacked America in 2001. And I'm spending so much time on this because I want you to realize that between the end of the conflict in the 1980s and, let's say, the 9/11 attacks, there were 14 years. So the consequences of what happened in Afghanistan was playing out not over 5 or 6 months, they were playing out over 5, 10, 15 years. And that's what I'm always saying to journalists when they are calling me and they are asking me, what's happened? We haven't had an attack for 3 or 4 months. Does that mean we were completely wrong? Does that mean that there's no threat? And I'm saying, well, right now it seems like it's over, but really the consequences of what's happening will play out over many years. One prediction I can make with certainty, which is that the future leader of the jihadist movement in 10 or 15 years will very likely be someone who is right now fighting in Syria, who has fought in Syria in the last 5 or 6 years. No one knows exactly what the future holds. The situation is in flux. There are, of course, game changers. Polarization in Europe I talked about. If there's a conflict between Saudi and Iran and the Middle East, we could have a situation that probably ends up being even worse than what we've seen in Syria over the past 5 or 6 years. A lot of people ask, will ISIS survive? Will the organization survive? No one knows. The question is not necessarily whether ISIS will survive, but what will happen to the personal networks that have been created over the past 5 or 6 years. People have created personal networks, and just like in the past, just like people who used to support Al-Qaeda became supporters of ISIS, it is definitely possible that people who now support ISIS will in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time support a new or a different organization that will emerge from ISIS. No one knows, but the personal networks, I do think they will persevere. Terrorism in Europe is likely to remain an issue, albeit for the time being not as urgent, as pressing as an issue as it was in 2014-15. We will have a mix of directed, enabled, and inspired plots. In the long term, will returnees lead to professionalization? I predicted that. We will see. You should expect the emergence of new profiles, new actors, women. Rajan spoke about so-called gangsters, copycats, and cumulative or reciprocal radicalization. The very final remark that brings it all together is that now is, of course, not the time to stop thinking about counterterrorism. I can see that with a lot of politicians that I speak to who say, well, it's over now, we can move on to the next thing. And the reality is, of course, that right now, the future of this movement will be decided. So if you want to understand, if you want to know where terrorism will come from in 5 or 10 years' time, you have to pay a lot of attention to what is happening right now. Because what happens right now determines very much who and what will be important in 5 or 10 years' time. So whilst it is understandable that a lot of the public are paying less attention to terrorism, and I think that's a good thing. We're all glad that there are not as many terrorist attacks right now as there used to be only 3 or 4 years ago. As professionals, as people who are professionally dealing with security challenges, I think now is almost as important, if not more important, a time to pay attention to this particular challenge, because what happens now will determine what we will be confronted by in the next 5, 10, even 15 years' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. So I open the floor to the questions. Just from Madeira, source. We have a question.
I was just telling to the colleague before, next time we will do the event in Madeira and have the video link from Lisbon.
Thank you very much to both professors. My question has to do with the impacts of Daesh's enterprises and intentions within our societies. As we know, and you've mentioned it briefly, Daesh does not depend on the concept of physical location in order to continue operating, since it is, as all things I assume, based upon an idea. Ideas are, of course, very difficult to vanish, and they do withstand time. So although Daesh's intentions to disaggregate and instigate a social implosion in the West have not fully materialized themselves, they have nonetheless been able to affect the sense of peace and stability of our societies. Going into a music concert or simply using public transport often entails a subconscious look directed towards fellow citizens to analyze if they might just be jihadist fundamentalists in disguise. In that sense, many believe that the most wicked consequence of Daesh's activities has probably been the instigation of fear and hatred around the places terrorist attacks take place. So my question is, in your opinion, what other psychosocial effects have resulted from Daesh's enterprises, and how can we impede them from creating a perpetual Hobbesian state of tension and mistrust? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will allow another question if you were to, so. Okay. We had one question. Yes, in Porto. Please, go on. I will take for you.
Sure. Anthony Marcus from Porto. First of all, I'd like to thank...
Can you speak louder, please? I'll try to connect the microphone. Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, Anthony Marcus from Porto. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the excellent talks. My question is relating to reciprocal radicalization. Is this a phenomenon that is related to organized far-right groups, or is this a phenomenon that is done by isolated, one-off initiatives by individuals? I think that's a very important difference if that can be clarified. If the far right is seemingly on the rise in Europe, and if reciprocal radicalization becomes a norm for the far right, problems will be much different than if it is one, in quotes, psychiatric patient that decides to do an attack in an isolated manner. Thank you.
Thank you. I will accept another question, a third question, please. Dr. Isabel Nunes. And then I go to Mar Maltese, okay? In the next set of questions.
Thank you. You have finalized your presentation by saying that you should not forget, you should refocus. And I would ask you both to elaborate a little bit further on if our political and social actors and agencies responsible for de-radicalization programs are adjusting to these new profiles you have just introduced to us, because I believe it's perhaps a different approach that these agencies and organizations and governments have to take, because they have a different counterpart to meet in terms of how to de-radicalize them. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor?
On the first question, I think you summarized it very well. And I always remind people that ultimately what you have to understand, I mean, as someone who has now studied terrorism for 15 or 20 years, at almost every event I go to, someone points out to me afterwards and says, but terrorism isn't really so bad. very few people die as a result of terrorist attacks. There are always these statistics, more people die because they fall out of windows or because lightning strikes them, etc., etc. And that's, of course, completely true, statistically speaking, but it also misses the point. And the very word terror is a clue here. Terrorism is not necessarily about killing a lot of people. It is not necessarily about creating physical effects. It is about creating psychological effects. It is literally about terrorizing societies. It is about manipulating fear. It is about messing with our brains. It is about polarizing societies. It is about making us all go crazy and distrust people on the tube or on the bus when we're seeing other people. And ISIS perhaps has understood that better than every other terrorist organization before, because it realized you don't have to fly a plane into the World Trade Center and kill 3,000 people. It can be enough to behead one person in front of a camera and put the video on YouTube. One person killed. It's not killing a lot of people, but we all go crazy, right? So that's the intention. That's the intention. And I think the best way of dealing with that is two things. First of all, it is to explain to every single member of the public that that is the intention, and that the worst we can do from our perspective is to play into the hands of the terrorists by doing exactly what the terrorist attack is intended to cause, namely going crazy, allowing them to mess with our brains, allowing them to manipulate us. Once we understand that that is the intention and that is the purpose of a terrorist attack, I think it becomes easier or more rational to resist it. The second thing we should do, and I'm saying that as a fairly liberal person who cares about terrorism. Normally in political discourses, the left always says we shouldn't care about terrorism. The right always overreacts to terrorism. My position is that precisely because I want to protect liberal society, I think we should do what we can to prevent terrorist attacks. We're doing liberal democracy a favor by preventing terrorist attacks. Because as much as we can teach people not to overreact to terrorist attacks, it is pretty damn hard not to overreact when people get killed in concerts, when bombs are exploding all around you. So I think counterterrorism, countering and preventing acts of terrorism, is ultimately a profoundly liberal activity because it is geared towards preserving our liberal order and allowing us to exist in a way that we don't have to distrust each other. The difficult question, and this is the eternal question of counterterrorism, is of course, at what point does preventing counterterrorism itself become a threat to liberal values? And that's a fine line, and there's no set answer to that. But what I'm always trying to say is that countering terrorism per se is ultimately, in my opinion, it is something that is ultimately geared towards preserving the liberalism and the freedom we have in our society, and it's ultimately geared towards protecting the liberal values that we want to protect. I could go on all night, but I will stop here. Just one word before Rajan probably has more to say about the far-right terrorist stuff. As far as I think, as I can see across Europe, a lot of the far-right attacks are mostly still quite disorganized. And we haven't seen the structures yet that we have seen on other sides of the terrorist threat. So the question was completely correct. A lot of the terrorist attacks are by so-called lone actors or people who are not in very firm structures, right? But there have been attempts to formalize that. Maybe you can...
Sure. So regarding reciprocal radicalization, we've mostly seen these cases of isolated individuals, often with mental health issues, carry out these attacks in response to what they perceive as the jihadist threat. But there are a few examples, I think, that are worth highlighting. The first is National Action in the UK. They were the first ever far-right group to be banned by the British authorities. They're essentially a neo-Nazi group. And they would adopt this language that espoused a white jihad, as they called it. And they would post pictures with the finger of Tawheed, sort of imitating what a lot of Islamic State supporters would do. And by looking at the communications of that group, National Action, you saw that they almost admired the jihadist movement for being willing to act on the beliefs. And this is something we consistently see in the far right. They have the grievances, they have the narratives, they have the social structures, but they never materialize on the same level as jihadist actors do in Europe. But we have seen them adopt the same language as the jihadist movement.
So we have seen them adopt the same language, to some extent the same tactics. You may remember Anders Breivik in 2011, the Norwegian guy who killed all these children. He published a very big manifesto, 1,500 pages, in which he confessed that he was using some of the online magazines of Al-Qaeda in order to learn about how to organize his terrorist attack. So there is a sort of cross-fertilization that is going on, albeit on the far right. It has to be said, and this is a statement perhaps also about the political situation in Europe, the reason why it hasn't become as big as perhaps you would have expected it to become is that people who are far right, not necessarily neo-Nazis, but close to neo-Nazis, right now in Europe have a lot of opportunities to organize politically. So there is a lot of channels in which they can put their energy that are legitimate, quote unquote, and that do not necessitate for them to blow things up. And if I was on the far right in France, for example, I mean, we've seen protests and it's not quite clear what they are, but they seem to be supported very strongly by people on the far right. But if I was a far right person in France, for example, I would not necessarily become a terrorist, because there are plenty of ways in which I can pursue my ideas without necessarily killing people or exposing myself or other people to the same risk. And so a lot of energy right now on the far right still goes into legal activity. Whether that will always be the case is another question, but for the time being, that is the case. And very brief answer to the third question on refocusing, and you're absolutely right. A lot of the prevention activities, for example, a lot of the de-radicalization programs that have thankfully emerged in all across Europe over the last 10 or 15 years are effectively geared towards young men, men in their 20s. And what we've seen with ISIS is, of course, women becoming more prominent. But for example, we've also seen much younger recruits. So we've seen recruits that are 13, 14, 15, but also older recruits. In Britain, for example, 2 of the 3 terrorist attacks of the last 2 years were carried out by people in their 30s. So a lot of these programs have to take that into account. Of course, not forgetting everything, but readjusting these programs to account for different demographics.
Thank you. So we'll allow another set of questions. Yeah. Please, Port.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. And I have several questions, so if you don't mind, I will email you later because I have already 6. So I've chosen to pose to you now. You've talked about the French uprising or something that is going on there, and you said it would be a far-right movement. But what do you think is the ISIS role in this uprising? Instigation, recruitment, monitoring, because not everyone is from the far-right movement. About the propaganda you showed to prey on their enemies' wealth, could we be facing an attempt of implosion of their enemies? And could they be attempting another financial crisis and the population anxiety, even insurgency as we are seeing? So governments have to turn back inside? Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Maltese, another question?
Thank you. I was a bit confused with your presentation, honestly. I know nothing about ISIS, but in your opinion, in your research, is ISIS a jihadist movement, which makes a lot of sense what has been presented, or is it a terrorist organization? Because then it also makes sense. So I just need that clarification, please.
Thank you. Okay, no more questions? The third question? The fourth question.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Professors, what we can expect from ISIS regarding cyber capability and cyber attacks? Thank you.
I think with the first two questions, I think the first question was referring to the yellow vests in Paris, correct? So, as I said, it's still very unclear as to who exactly is behind it and where to put it, if you want, politically. There was one survey, however, that was published yesterday, where people were being asked, do you support the activities of the Yellow Vests? And by far the strongest support that they received was from people who also supported the National Front, who supported Marine Le Pen and her organization. I think nearly half of the Le Pen supporters supported the activities of the Yellow Vests. And if you read some of the manifestos that have been published, so there have been different manifestos have been published, and because it's so unclear who exactly leads the movement, they have to be taken with a grain of salt. But some of the manifestos are quite consistent, so they are asking for France to leave the EU, they are asking for France to leave NATO, they have quite contradictory messages on public funding, lowering taxes. It is more or less the sort of, I would say, almost Trumpian Bannonite agenda that speaks from some of these manifestos. So whilst there is, of course, a debate to be had, and we will learn more about these movements, I would probably put them more on the populist right-wing end of the spectrum than necessarily, certainly not in the center. And I think we will learn more about who exactly they are. In terms of what they are trying to cause, I think I have never read any statement by ISIS saying we want to cause a financial crisis or we want to cause a particular political event. What you can find is statements by ISIS saying that dividing European societies or crisis amongst Western countries suits our agenda. So yes, they would of course welcome a financial crisis, and yes, of course, they do welcome if our societies are becoming more polarized, if Muslims are becoming more marginalized, if far-right populists are becoming stronger. And they welcome that because it confirms their idea of their system being a superior system, but they also argue, for example, in some of their internal documents, that it makes it easier for them to recruit new supporters. Because the more marginalized Muslims feel in Western societies, the more receptive they will be to the message of ISIS, which is to say that you cannot be French and Muslim at the same time. You have to choose. Are you French or are you Muslim? If you're Muslim, you have to be against France. And this sort of black-white message, this sort of us versus them, this kind of enemy-type thinking is, of course, something that all extremists share and that all extremists require in order to find supporters and recruits. So whilst I don't think they're necessarily having a master plan to cause a financial crisis, they know exactly that instability and crisis suits their agenda because ultimately it makes it easier for them to support people. So I must confess I'm a bit confused about your question, but I will try to answer it. ISIS is a terrorist organization, but if you wanted to situate that terrorist organization ideologically, then you would put it within the jihadist movement. The jihadist movement is, of course, much broader than ISIS, and we have seen different organizations come out of that movement. So for a very long time, Al-Qaeda was perhaps the most important organization coming out of that movement. And at the beginning of this decade, in the early 2010s, Al-Qaeda clearly had a crisis, and it was not as strong as it used to be. And in 2013, with the Syrian conflict, we then had some people split from Al-Qaeda and become ISIS. And in a way, it is very important, in fact, to think about these groups not necessarily only in terms of organizations, but also as the manifestations of broader movements. There has been a jihadist movement, as most people who work in this area would describe it, since the Afghanistan conflict from 1979 onwards. And this movement has given rise to many different organizations. The most prominent and perhaps the most dangerous one recently has been ISIS. And that allows me, in fact, to return to my final point from the presentation, which is that even if there is a decline of ISIS as a terrorist organization, we shouldn't necessarily think of that as an end to the threat. Because whilst organizations come and go and they rise and decline, maybe the same people who are part of that movement and who have these convictions, ideological convictions that I talked about, will then manifest themselves in a different organization. So organizations are important and organizations need to be followed. But even if organizations decline, the movements behind them may not necessarily have disappeared. 40,000 people have joined ISIS over the last 4 or 5 years. Some of them have died, but many of them are still there. Some of them have become disillusioned with the jihadist ideology behind it. Some of them may have become disillusioned with ISIS. Some of them may now retire and decide not to do anything anymore. But some of them may in fact decide to form a different organization.
We'll say, regarding the final question on the cyber threat from ISIS, generally it's considered that they have the intention but not the capability to carry out a sustained cyber campaign. And what we've seen from ISIS's so-called cyber caliphate unit in the past are quite isolated attacks on websites to gather information that often was already in the public domain. So they would list the addresses of US service personnel online. So they would publicize somewhat discrete information that is actually already out there. But beyond that, we don't really see major attacks carried out in the cybersphere by ISIS. And many of the famous ISIS cyber players, like Junaid Hussain, have actually been taken out in Syria and Iraq. So we've yet to see them fully materialize as much as they would like to.
Concerning cyber, you have a comment, sir?
No, I agree with Rajan. For ISIS, the internet is principally and primarily a propaganda instrument. It uses it very heavily for that purpose, even though it's become more difficult to do that. But there's very, very few instances that are documented where ISIS has tried to engage in cyber terrorism, which means using the internet as a weapon. We have, a lot of people have spoken about that, have written about that, have predicted it, but it simply hasn't happened yet. And as Rajan says, the reason may be that as much as they like talking about it, as much as they like threatening people, they simply do not have the capability to do it. All the big cyber attacks that we've seen over recent years, in some way or another, had state support. State actors are still the most dangerous actors in the cyber arena. And terrorist organizations, when they were not state support, when they are getting state support, they do become dangerous. When they are not having state support, often they haven't been as dangerous as many people thought.
Thank you. More questions, please? Since we have time, just myself, I have a question.
Okay.
Two questions.
There you go.
First time, as a Portuguese, the only time you referred Portugal during your presentation was to say it doesn't affect Portugal as it affects the other countries in Europe. That's the single mention you made to Portugal. I wonder, is there a special reason for that?
So, I think first of all, it does affect you in some respects, of course. I don't think you have a very large indigenous, homegrown threat. I do think that if there is a threat in Portugal, it is, this will make me very popular in Portugal, but not necessarily in your neighboring country. It will perhaps be something that comes from Spain. And I think that in Europe, where we have more or less open borders and people can travel from one place to the next, I think it is very important to also take into account and be interested in the threat situation in neighboring countries, because we saw with Paris and Brussels, the terrorist attacks in Paris were planned in Brussels. And so there's no reason ultimately why there couldn't be a terrorist attack in Portugal that is planned in Spain, and vice versa. So we can't any longer have the mindset that we only care about what happens in our country. We have to also think about what happens in neighboring countries. In that sense, this is something that affects you, of course. But I do think that Portugal is less affected. If you look at northern and northwestern European countries, they are typically countries which have had 2 or 3 generations of often not very successful integration of Muslim communities into their countries. And if you look at where jihadist recruits have come from, for example, in France or Belgium, they often come from parts of these societies, let's say from the suburbs of Paris or from Molenbeek in the city of Brussels, where over the years you have seen, if you want, the formation of almost ghetto-like entities, where people often with immigrant backgrounds have almost become isolated from the rest of society, have been cut off also from economic, social, political opportunities in those societies, and where for a long time you've seen this result in many of these people becoming criminals. Now, increasing number of them have become involved in jihadist terrorism. And ultimately that points to very severe social, political, economic problems in these societies that, fortunately, I don't think you have on the same scale in Portugal as they exist, for example, in France or in Belgium. So I think ultimately going back to the root causes of disaffection, feeling of marginalization, being excluded from society, that is much, much stronger and more severe in relation to every economic and social indicator in countries like France and Belgium than it is, for example, in Portugal. So on that, you know, you've done well.
Thank you. Okay, since we don't have more questions. Well, just like 1 month ago, I got impressed by the way, the comprehensive, direct and simple way how you pass your message. It's very clear.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And very well supported, so I think we had a good discussion, a very good conference. I just have to thank for the high and prestigious contribution of our lectures and everybody. I just want to
Thank you.